Your story and how you connect with the outside world is one of your most valuable assets. It is worthy of investment. If you look at the brands that you aspire to be, the enduring companies that make an impact in the world, they are all storytelling brands to some degree.
This is Melanie.
And this is Christian.
You're listening to Follow the Gradient, the weekly podcast with actionable insights about how to build a business while staying sane. Welcome back to another episode of our Follow the Gradient podcast. Today, we're diving into the critical role that communication teams play in startups. Comms professionals in the startup world wear many hats, but perhaps their most important role is that of a translator, turning complex tech jargon into accessible language, aligning internal teams with a shared vision, and translating global strategies to resonate locally. But there is one role that truly tests the mettle of any comms person: managing a crisis. It's in these moments that all those skills come to bear. And the difference between effective and poor crisis comms can either minimize the challenge or amplify it into a full-blown PR disaster. So before we give the floor to today's guest, let's talk about two recent examples for a minute that show very well what the impact of a good or not so good comms strategy is. First, there's Intuit. A few weeks back when the CEO was faced with tough questions in a public interview, Intuit's approach was to demand edits, attempting to control the narrative by censoring the interview. This kind of heavy-handed attempt to scrub a difficult moment only ended up attracting more attention, backfiring in a big way. On the other hand, there was CrowdStrike back in July this year, facing a massive public outage that affected millions of systems globally. They responded quickly and transparently, with their CEO taking responsibility, providing consistent updates, and being forthright in both social media and interviews. Their handling turned a potential catastrophe into a chance to reinforce trust.
These recent examples of tech companies remind us just how critical it is to get communication in general and crisis communication in particular right. Today, we have someone with us who has extensive experience on these topics, Ruth Barnett. Ruth is a seasoned communications expert with a diverse background in journalism and strategic communications for top tech companies. After roles at Sky News, Snap, and DeepMind, she recently led UK and Europe communications at Sequoia Capital, where she worked closely with numerous startup founders. This year, she founded Grit and Inc., a consultancy that offers bespoke communication strategies to founders and leaders. Ruth's extensive experience and her insight into the startup world made her the ideal guest to discuss how startups can effectively manage crisis and build resilient communication strategies. In our interview today, she shares why storytelling is foundational to effective internal and external communications, how to prepare your comms team for a crisis before it hits, what strategies to pursue when you are facing a real crisis, and that comms is something everybody can learn, including technical founders.
By the way, we're doing all this as a side hustle to help people through the craziness of startup life. If you like what you're hearing, sign up to your newsletter at followthegradient.io. In this week's newsletter, Ruth also shares exclusive insights she hasn't shared on the podcast.
But now, without further ado, let's dive right in.
Ruth, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here. You've had a fascinating career from journalism to leading communications at top tech companies. After working for big companies like Snap or DeepMind, you decided to work with startups as comms lead at Sequoia Capital in the UK and Europe, and now you're building your own company. What are some of the biggest challenges founders face when it comes to managing communications?
Well, firstly, Melanie, Christian, I just want to say thank you so much for having me and also for creating this series, because I think there's not enough tactical hands-on advice out there for people who are starting and scaling things in the UK and Europe. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak to your audience. But look, I think that the biggest shock that founders experience is actually that communications is going to be part of their job every day and forever. And I think that not everyone is prepared for that. You might have had a different role in an organization before. You might have been the technical one. You might have been behind the scenes. And then suddenly, actually, communications doesn't start and end with press releases and journalists. That's probably a tiny fraction of it. It's actually how you're engaging and attracting talent. It's how you're getting investment. It's how you're going to get and retain customers. And being a storyteller is going to be part of your job forever. And I always think there's a bit of a founder's paradox where, on the one hand, to be a successful founder, you have to have this unique vision. You have to be super stubborn. You have to have this thing in the world that you can see that needs to be different and a solution for it that no one else can see. But actually, in your day-to-day life as a founder and a leader, you're now having to put yourself in everyone else's shoes all the time and speak from their perspective. So when you're a storyteller, you need to speak from your customers' perspectives. You need to speak from your investors' perspectives, press's perspectives. And so how do you flex between, the stubborn in your own head vision and actually then speaking from these other perspectives? It's a really hard thing. And I think not everyone feels a natural when they start doing that.
Absolutely. And in this regard, can you share maybe a quick win or low-hanging fruit in communications that startups often overlook?
Yeah, I think if you're an early startup and you're not in stealth, I would really think about how, as a founder, you can start showing up on social channels. And probably today, I'd suggest LinkedIn. There's two benefits to this. One is if you can start to build a community around what you're creating, the sooner the better. But actually, I think the bigger benefit is you start to build your own muscle as an individual and as an organization for how to engage and tell your story, how to have the feedback loop with the outside world about what is connecting, what isn't, and defining what you do, making it succinct and making it part of the rhythm of your job. I think the sooner you can get into doing that before you become, hopefully, big headline news, the better. And it also then creates this wonderful breadcrumb effect for when eyeballs do come to look at you and what you're building, you've told a story for them to find. They're not having to put the pieces together themselves.
Many founders might not initially think about hiring a dedicated comms professional. And in your experience, when does it make sense for a startup to actually bring in an agency or an in-house expert? And at what particular stage do you usually see the turning point?
I think that's a really good question because it's a really hard question. And the truthful answer is probably it depends. I think it certainly can be too early. And as we were just talking about, actually, as a founder and a leader, you have to be storyteller number one at the beginning. And you're doing that to bring in talent and investors anyway. So it should be part of your daily mindset. I think that when you start to have customers and you start to need to engage in a really proactive way in the outside world, it can be useful to have someone support you on that. Now, look, there are pros and cons to whether you go in-house or pick an agency. I think the upside of an in-house person is you get someone who really understands you and your business. They're on the inside, they feel it, they care about it, and they can join the dots for you and be that sort of bridge between what you're building inside the walls and what the outside world is interested in. But it's really hard to find one person who has the whole skill set within them that's affordable, scrappy enough. Like, that is a hard find. And I'm asked for recommendations for those kind of people all the time. And it's hard. And it's hard to find one person who can fit for life, right? In the life cycle of your business. And so I think the upside of an agency is you get that breadth of expertise. You can dial them up and down. They've got different people who might be specialists in different things. And it's actually quite easy in relative terms to change up your provider. So you have a really good connection to the outside world, but you've created an intermediary, and they're also only going to be as good as the time and energy you put in to having them understand your business and your goals and your voice and what matters to you. And so it doesn't always save you as much time as you'd think.
And to dig a little bit deeper on that particular point, what does comms actually mean in a startup context? And where should it sit, right? Is that a marketing thing, or is that something which is clearly positioned in the CEO office, for instance?
Another great question, because I think actually comms, and we as comms professionals have to understand we have a comms problem. We have somehow as a sector not created language that's specific enough to explain what we do and the value that we bring to the table. And I think that's on us, and it makes us very hard to hire and hard to evaluate because we use some of the similar language to mean very different things. I think for me, communications in a startup is how you show up in the outside world. And so, yes, that would include press and media relations, but actually it also includes what the company story is, the touch points you're going to have with the outside world, how those external channels look and feel, where the founder shows up and speaks, all of that universe. There might be other people who have a role to play in that, but to me, that is the comms space. Where it sits organizationally, I think, again, it changes. I think it's often the first topic, actually, comms people will talk about when we meet up for coffee, like, how do you structure your team and how has that evolved? And it's vastly different when you become a scale up, when you're Series B and beyond, to when you're just starting out. Obviously, I think comms needs to have influence at the top table. You need a reputation mindset to be there, partly to understand the needs of the business and to then advocate for the outside world back into that top table. People have different views about that. I think most comms people are really just happy to have internal influence and impact and report to someone great who gets it. And I think we're pretty pragmatic about who that might be in any particular organization.
You now said like it's very much about the outside. Where do you see the task of internal comms? Is it also with the comms person, or is this something that HR should run, or even the CEO office should run? Or because it's like with this word of comms, like it's everywhere and nowhere. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think internal comms is really important. I think internal comms hires tend to come a little later. And by the way, they are one of the hardest things to hire. I have hired some amazing ones, but finding them is like gold dust. I think that the employee audience is a really critical one. And actually the CEO should be worrying about that. Again, irrespective of where you might put that function in your organization. I can see how HR might feel an ownership of the culture. I don't know if I think that model works. I think I prefer to see it as a storytelling muscle again. And one where you really understand that actually your core audience as a leader and your core communicators are actually your own people. And if they cannot go advocate for you, if they cannot understand and feel on board with change, if they feel like they're hearing things from the press before they're hearing them from you, like you're just missing, you're probably creating a problem for yourself, but more than anything, you're missing an opportunity to leverage at scale this team.
And now you already hinted about it. Comms is sometimes very abstract for people who don't work in comms. And so there is always this question, especially from people who are very numbers driven. What is the actual value of effective communication? And are there any metrics that can best demonstrate the success of communication efforts so that really ROE focused stakeholders understand it? Or what is your take on that?
How to measure PR's impact is older than the startup ecosystem. It's certainly older than me. And so, it's again, $1 million question. I think there are three important things to keep in mind that probably sound contradictory, but I think do hang together. One is your story and how you connect with the outside world is one of your most valuable assets. It is worthy of investment. If you look at the brands that you aspire to be, the enduring companies that make an impact in the world, they are all storytelling brands to some degree. Yes, they solve a problem. Yes, they're at a great price point, all the rest of it, but you're buying into and you have a feeling about the quality you're getting, what it's going to do for your life or your business. And that feeling is a sort of comms and reputation space. So is it valuable? Absolutely. Secondly, I think measuring comms impact for startups is very overrated. And I'll drill into that. I think you can waste a lot of money on tools and add-ons that try and look at your share of voice, try and look at, your volume. And I just think it is the wrong thing to focus on. When you are company building at that early stage, you are not Coca-Cola, where you've got multiple markets, a huge volume of sentiment and signal in and out, where you need to keep track of how you're performing in that in a numeric sense. In a startup, never optimize for quantity. You need to optimize for quality. And the moment you're putting numeric goals on an agency or a comms person, I think you're starting to incentivize the wrong behavior, because actually there's a quality game and a feelings game and a laser focus game. And there's probably a small number of people who actually matter. maybe an investor set, a customer set, partners set, talent. You want to reach them with the right message. And so that is worth so much more than just volume. So I would not spend on measurement tools, and I'm sure that will make me unpopular in some quarters. I think the third point actually comes back to comms people and where we are responsible for this question being asked, and we need to meet it in good faith. When you're being asked about your ROI, I think it is actually code for, I don't have faith that you, the comms team or function, deeply understand the levers in this business and are closely connected to what it's going to need to survive and thrive. That is what you're being asked. And so actually, I think you need to take that head on and show that you really, really understand the business. You really, really understand what matters, and you are targeting your time and attention and creativity to solving that. There is one strategy that I have used quite a lot of times with founders or in coaching comms people with founders, and that's to work on an 80-20 rule, which is, okay, I'm going to dedicate 80% of the time and resource to really narrowly mapping my activity to these business goals. I'll have OKRs. We'll sort of speak the language of the rest of the maybe technical business. But I want to reserve 20% of my time and resources for magic. And by that, I mean things that don't have an immediate ROI. They're not linked to it. You're not going to see the sales graph go up, but it's a way of saying, trust me. We're going to also do some creative things. We're going to take some risks. I'm going to ask you to take some calls and some meetings that you can't see right now how it's going to lead to sales. But if you're not investing that, you are not building, you're not giving yourself as a company the chance to build a true reputation, something elevated, something that is bigger and bolder. You're playing a numbers game and a tactics game. And so I always work with comms people to help them carve out a bit of space for magic.
I think we can really resonate with that focus on pragmatism and kind of giving some headspace for creativity, right? Magic, as you called it. I think in so many startups, it's very hard to measure something, but that doesn't mean that the things you're doing are ineffective, right? I'd like to turn to a kind of elephant in the room when it comes to comms, right? The crisis communication. Two parts of the question. One, how would you define a crisis in the context of a startup? And when it comes to, for instance, real world war stories, what are some of the most common crises you've encountered, whether it was during your time at Sequoia or before?
Yeah, crisis, I think, gets to the heart of when comms can show up and have value. And it also comes to the heart of who you are as a company. And actually, a crisis can be an opportunity to show an audience, particularly the audience that is hurt in some way, show them your true colors and use that as an opportunity. But I think people are very fearful of crisis. I think in startups and early stage companies, they are actually relatively rare, real crises. I think internal crises are constant, and that's startup life. But I think it's a good question to work out what's a real crisis. And I think probably there are three things I would walk myself through to try and assess that. The first one is, who's hurt? Is this your customers? Is it vulnerable people? How hurt are they? Have they lost their life savings? Are they injured in some other way? Or is this your hurt feelings as a founder from criticism, feedback, or something that hasn't gone quite right? And I think it's really important to work out who's hurt and keep them the focus. And sometimes you have to put your own ego outside and keep it on the actual impact that's happening here. And normally that can sort the wheat from the chaff of, is this a problem we really need to all get in a room to solve? Or is this something that hurts us, but actually we can rally, do better, and it's not actually a crisis comms moment? I think the second thing is to just start with the ground truth. What actually happened? Did you make a mistake? Is there actually a problem here? And I think people rush to the words of how do we respond to the allegation or the press inquiry or the tweet. And they're not actually first starting with, what did we do something wrong here? Has something broken? What are the facts of that situation? Because again, that can tell you what kind of problem you're dealing with. And then I think the third part is to map out the potential consequences. Start playing the chess. What happens if we sit on this and ignore it? What are the potential fallouts of that? What happens if we over-index? I don't know, give all of the customers refunds. Do we go bust? How does it play out? Because actually you need to try and get yourself into a future state and work backwards, and not in a panic state and do the sort of near-term thing that brings a sort of sense of activity or relief, you have to start playing a long game because you make decisions that box you in the future. So I think those are the three ways I would work that out. I think that you asked about the kinds of crisis that you see. I think for a lot of early companies, there are three kinds that you'll see. One is that maybe your story outpaced your execution. And that is sort of, you've got ahead of your skis. And that is, I think, when you start getting maybe negative feedback from customers or press, that it's maybe hype over substance. And I think that is a really valuable feedback lesson, to always focus first on building something real. And the storytelling comes from that. Do not tell a story and hope for the best. And so actually, I think those can be useful course correct moments when you get that feedback. And if as a founder, you don't have a great radar for the difference between hype and bending the truth, that is a problem for you. And it should be a problem for the people around you. And I think the earlier you course correct, if you can, the better. I think poor execution is the next one. You put something out in the world that just frankly wasn't quite as good as you thought it was or hoped it was. The website crashed, that something didn't actually go through. And again, actually, this can be an opportunity to show that audience who you are fundamentally, how the lengths you'll go to fix it, that you're listening. And again, those do not have to be existential if you are good at understanding the impact and addressing it. I think the third type is harder, which is essentially poor conduct, either by you, the leader, or someone in your team. They are the hardest to fix and rebuild from because it takes a lot of courage to see it and not just play defense. And it takes a lot of time to rebuild trust. And it takes a lot of time to understand maybe the facts of a situation. And you might be a lot more constrained about what you can say when there are people and behaviors involved. And so I think those are hardest. But I think true crises have been blessedly few and far between. And I think I've been in the room more when it's been a later stage company where you have something big enough to impact a volume of people, to be headline worthy and to, have that level of scrutiny, I think tends to come a little later. But the sooner you learn the lessons on your way up, the better fixed you'll be when it comes.
And that's exactly my next point. When a crisis hits, it's often almost too late to start thinking about crisis management. So from your experience, what should startups do to prepare for potential crisis before they happen? How should a crisis plan correctly look like? And maybe can you walk us through a simple crisis communication template that startups can adapt?
Yeah, I think there are definitely things you can do in advance of a crisis hitting. I think the one thing you don't need to do, and just save your time, is mapping out some big grid of all the things that could come wrong and all the things you're going to say and do when they happen, because it's a fool's errand. You will spend a lot of time on it. You're probably picking the wrong things. If you knew what the crisis was going to be, go fix it. Don't prepare your reactive statement. So I personally am not a fan for that. I've done it because it makes you feel safe and proactive, but invariably you don't even open the document when the moment comes. So I think the two things I would recommend doing in advance is, one, be truth seeking and go understand the elephants in the room in your business. Because I think a lot of the time when there is a crisis, someone somewhere knew that flaw was in your tech stack, knew that flaw was in the product, knew that flaw was in the way that you were dealing with customers or were hearing it from customers. Have you created an environment where you, the leader, know what those issues are, people feel able to bring them to you, and you're getting ahead of fixing them? They're not all predictable crises, but I think particularly when it's a product or a tech or a customer crisis, ultimately, actually, if you dig deep, you did know that maybe there was a flaw. And I think the companies that are good at looking themselves in the mirror, looking themselves in the eye and getting on with it, save themselves a lot of pain. I think the second thing is decide in advance who needs to be in the room. So when a difficult moment comes, you know who needs to be there. You're not dealing with the politics of that on the hoof. And I think probably you need someone technical, you need expertise, maybe. You probably might need a lawyer. And I think startups, it might be the first time you've thought about that. But I think in a really high stakes moment, good legal advice is actually really valuable. And they've seen this before. So often they can be calm, helpful people in the room. And then I think you need to decide who signs off actions and statements. Is it just the CEO? Is it all of the co-founders? Is it the whole executive team? What can happen if someone's on a plane? I had a situation I worked on where the key principal decision maker was on a plane, and we just did not have time to figure out, what can we put out in the company's name, which is essentially their name. And often, you can sometimes buy for time, but that's where you have to have had a good relationship that people know you're telling the truth. And being on a plane is not a euphemism. That means we're on a plane. So thinking through how you're actually going to make those decisions, I think, is a really core thing. Whether there's a template, I don't know. I think there is a sort of decision making, a series of decisions and almost gateways you need to go through. And I think we've touched on some of them. One is, what is the ground truth and how quickly can you understand what's gone wrong? And if you can't understand, it might take some time. So what do you need to say to who in the meantime? Who's hurt? Who matters here? And actually, I think internal audiences are really, really key. If you start to lose the goodwill of your staff, if you start to lose the faith of your investors, don't optimize for the press statement. First, optimize for, the people who you need to be your advocates and defenders and who you need to show up to work tomorrow. And if you've missed them because you're optimizing for how to deal with a press inquiry, I think that's a mistake. I think then I would think about what path shows who you really are. And again, I think there's lots of companies who found crisis moments as being a moment to show their customer centricity. I'm sure I heard on stage an anecdote from Tony Zhu from DoorDash, where they had an early issue and they had to issue a bunch of refunds, and it was going to take them, I think, cash wise, pretty close to the brink. But they did it, and they did it to show that the customer came first. And actually that brought so much goodwill, it's become part of the sort of fabric of their brand, right? So these are moments. So I think knowing who you are and how you want to show up in that moment. I think the fourth thing is think about who you trust. And maybe it's having good lawyers or good comms people that you can call on. I'd also recommend having an external person who's maybe a bit contrary, who is able to tell you the truth, and you can run a statement by them. And actually, if they hear something different in it or think it's coming off a certain way, you've done your due diligence. So plan who that might be. And then lastly, wash up afterwards, learn from it. What was too slow? What do you regret? What did you say in haste that you wish you hadn't? What could you have seen coming if you were honest with yourself? And if you make it that full circle, I think you feel a lot more robust for the next time round.
How did you fix the issue with the person on the plane? Or what did you change after that?
I mean, sometimes that's just the way it falls, right? I've also had, probably one of the hardest crisis comms issues I ever dealt with in my career. I answered the phone call while I was, paddling in the ocean on holiday with my family. And I just answered the phone, and it was a reporter, and they had something to put to me, and that was the holiday gone. And I sometimes think, what if I hadn't picked up the phone? But actually, I think, like most comms people, you'd actually much rather that you picked up the phone, and you want to be at the table in those moments. But, Murphy's Law, as they say, like, it always comes at a difficult time. I think where I've seen good teams work well is where you know each other, you trust each other, and then actually you almost can have a sort of shift pattern where one of you can say, hey, I've got a commitment and I have to go honor this thing. Can someone deputize for me? And you have a really good language and trust for doing that, and distilling what matters and what's just busy work that doesn't actually get to the kernel of it. But yeah, there will always be the surprise twist. It never comes when you think it comes.
Crazy, simply a crazy story. I think, fortunately, crisis comms is something that startups don't need on an everyday basis. So maybe we go back to the broader comms topic. What's the biggest misconception you see founders have about comms?
I think the most common two things are that comms is press releases and journalists, and that you can just switch that on one day. Right, we're ready. Where's the press coverage? And then often actually that can be an expectation and blame game with either your internal people or the agencies you partner with, because you haven't had a storytelling mindset from day one. And actually you're now trying to do it at the 11th hour. And so I think being a leader who thinks in stories, and by stories, I mean, real truth, not fiction, I mean how to tell that truth in a way that is engaging to that audience, that speaks to what they care about, that is succinct and in terminology that they understand. And I think the founders who understand that that is their job from day one, not something they think about 2 years in when they're now ready to dial up the volume, is they are in such a better place, even if they haven't done press before. And I think the second thing is often that actually comm skills can be learned. And I hear actually most commonly from UK or European founders, oh, I'm just not good at that. I'm not a public speaker. And it's like, well, very few people start good. They get good through practice, repetition. They get good by finding people whose advice they're willing to take and listen to. They get good by understanding it's important and considering it a craft. But I will tell you this, having been ringside seat for some amazing communicators in my career, they all prepare. Absolutely every single one of them prepares. Even if it's bullet points, even if it's 2 key points they want to land, some with proper role play prep where we'll go again and again and again and again and again, and they'll refine and they'll take feedback and they'll watch videos of themselves. But I think that it's a cop out to say, I'm not good at this. Like, okay, we're not good at many things. There are lots of us who are on hand to work with you on that. Let's see it as a thing that can be learned, and just like a technical skill or just like a muscle. And so, I think people just think it's a good or bad. I'm not going to be that kind of founder. I'm out. And actually, I think that's a waste.
I think one particular group of founders that think that they're not natural story tellers are often the technical founders. Of course, there are also others, but so many founders with technical backgrounds, they are not used to be front and center externally. What themes do you see with technical founders in particular, and what do you see also helping them?
I love that you've asked this, because I think it's been one of the surprises of my career that my favorite thing to do is work with highly technical founders. The academics, the scientists, the reluctant spokespeople. I would far rather work with someone who I have to sort of coax to trust me and come out to the public stage than someone who thinks that is, they're ready from day one. And I think there is one theme I hear over and over when I listen to technical founders, and that is there's an imbalance in their storytelling and they're over indexing on the how. So I think if you're technical, you know the detail of your space, you know why your solution is differentiated and interesting and better and solves this problem in a better way. And that's so intellectually interesting to you, and you spend all your time there, that is your opener. And actually, one of the first jobs I do when I partner with a technical founder is to almost say, I trust you on that pillar. That pillar of the story is sound. You know it better than I will ever know. It's not going to be, I'm not here to refine how you refer to, to that part. But there are other pillars to this story. And actually, most audiences need you to start somewhere else. They absolutely need a what, which is a one-line distillation of what you do. Really hard, actually. And I found this when I launched my own business, really hard. But they need a what. They need a why. Why is there a problem in the universe that needs a better solution, and what will be the consequences if this is done well, and what are the consequences for life, society, productivity, whatever, if it's not done? If I believe that there's a problem that needs a different solution, when you get to that how, I'm already on your journey. If you start me with the how, I don't know how to anchor myself in why this matters. And I think particularly when you're speaking to investors, press, lay people, broader talent ecosystem, that journey, you have to restructure your story. And then the other bit that they always miss out is what I think of as the 2 who's. Who does this matter to? There has to be a type of person or organization who is lying awake at night with this problem, whether they fully conceptualize it the way you do or not, that this matters to. And if you cannot tell me who this is for, we've got a problem. And the second who is, you have to tell me who you are, because ultimately most crowded spaces have many people going at a problem. You have to find some way to communicate why you are the team that can go the distance. You are the team with the unique insight and the credibility, and we can trust you. And I think people forget that it's actually in the balance of all of those pillars that a really compelling proposition is built. And if you just come in with a how, especially with the technical founder, like, we're already bought in, we know you're the expert in that. It's the rest of the piece that actually I tend to spend my time working with them to bolster.
Very interesting insight on the storytelling part, I think. And we had a couple of weeks back, actually, Amy Levin from Sifted on the show, who talked about how to engage with the media, how to kind of place your story. At what point in time, from your own perspective, does it make sense to actually work with a PR agency instead of doing everything in-house? And if you do that, how can founders get the most out of a PR agency?
Yeah, I think there are some brilliant PR agencies out there who really know what they're doing, and they can add a huge amount of value to your business. I think how to find the right one for you is a really hard question, because there's a lot of big names, there's a lot of jargon in the industry, which again is on us as comms people. And so navigating that is really hard. I think recommendations help a lot, but also you're not comparing like for like. And one of the things I always ask founders, who they've had a good experience with, and often you hear totally contradictory signals, because either they're a B2B business and now I'm speaking to a B2C business and it didn't fit, or there was a particular individual that connected. So I think often you have to work it out who you're trying to speak to and whether this team has the expertise to reach that audience. And also you have to feel that there's a connection for you. Do you feel that they are curious and excited about what you do? Do you feel this is a team you can trust? You have to let them in on your business. And so if you don't have a kind of chemistry there, then I think that is going to be a flaw for you. But often these are people who have maintained, if in a good way, they should be people who've built and maintained these relationships. And so they can also help contextualize how to do the media outreach. And I think it's very common to have an outlet in mind that you really, really want. And actually, it's great to go shoot for that. But if we start from the question of what are your goals? What's the audience you need to reach? Actually, often the founder will reach a different conclusion to actually, there might be a different way. Do developers read that outlet? I don't know. You start to ask the question a different way. And a PR agency, a good one, should be really excellent at working with you. What I would say, though, is I think the wrong fit can cost you a lot of money very quickly. And I think the other mistake that founders make with PR agencies is you go back to that measurement question. You want to feel like you're going to get a good result for your money. And so actually you push down on the budget and you push up on the sort of quantitative impact that you want to see. And so you end up with one of these scopes where it's deliver 10 pieces of tech coverage or tier 1 coverage. I hate that phrase. What is tier 1 coverage? Like meaningless. It depends on who you're trying to reach. And actually, no one enjoys those contracts. So I think the PR agency are already started by having to optimize for the wrong thing. They're optimizing for volume and numbers, and they need to answer each month or quarter, here's all the things that we did. And you're also coming at it from is this going to cost me money I can't afford? I need to, crack the whip to get the outcomes I need. It's the wrong dynamic. And you would not believe the number of people who then actually call me to say, hang on, we've gone awry. Like, this is not, the relationship isn't right. And so I think you have to work out what your actual goal is and partner on that together and co-create then a scheme of work together that is meaningfully going to move the business forwards. And you should be able to feel that. You should feel that impact. And it shouldn't need to come down to whether it was 9 or 10 or 3 or 12, right? Like, it's just the wrong conversation, but it happens every day of the week.
Ruth, it was we would have a ton of more questions. It was so valuable what you've shared. If a founder could only implement one communication strategy tomorrow, what should it be and why?
I think spending time on your foundational story and starting to flex the muscle of telling it, whether that's when you gather the team together, whether it's when you pitch investors, well before you ever become headline news, have a sense of story and the problem you solve and learn to tell it and get better at refining it and see that as a thing to be curious about. There is never not going to be the payoff to that. And I think if I can add a second, I think it's similarly to think really hard about reputation in the truest sense. what do people say about you, your company, your product when you're not in the room? It's really hard to get off the ground if people aren't recommending you, talking about you, and fundamentally backing you. And if they don't buy into you, at 1-to-1 in that small early stage, like, you fix that problem now and you've put yourself in a position to scale and grow.
Ruth, that sounds like a perfect wrap up. Thank you so much for being on our show. Very last question. How can our listeners get in touch with you and learn more about your work at Grit and Ink?
I'd be delighted to hear from your listeners. Probably the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. I am a very unusual outfit. I'm a solo consultancy by design to try and overcome some of those challenges that founders experience when they're trying to find exactly the right comms partner for the moment that they're in. So it means I only ever take on a couple of clients at a time, but I'm a real sucker for any highly technical moonshots, high integrity teams, AI for science. All of those kind of spaces are particularly appeal to me. So I'm always happy to hear from your listeners.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for being on our show. We learned a ton. I'm sure our listeners will love this episode. Thanks again for being here.
My pleasure.
This was another episode of Follow the Gradient.
And now we would love to hear from you. How did you like it? What should we improve? Do you have any suggestions, ideas, or dream podcast guests? Please let us know.
Thank you and see you again next week.